This is the Giant Mouse Ace Jagt. And looked it up. Jagt seems to be the pronunciation of this. This is an Italian-made giant mouse. J-A-G-T. Just like that. This is Clark the Knife. Goal is to get you in and out of here with a complete understanding of everything you need to know about this knife. My own experience with it, primarily focusing on utility. And hopefully, this is the only video you need to watch to determine if this is the right knife for you. Let's get to it. I'm going to try to accomplish that goal. This Jagt from Giant Mouse has a MagnaCut blade that is, right here, 3.27 inches long. Your entire knife here is 8 inches long. Your knife is 4.2 ounces overall. This blade is 0.155 inches thick, which you'll recognize is quite thick blade stock. We'll get back to that. This is made by Giant Mouse in Italy, and it retails for $215. Yes, I do have a couple tiny little mites crawling on my paper here. So, those are your specs for the Giant Mouse Ace Jagt. Came onto the market, I don't know, somewhere around 1 to 2 years ago, and is part of sort of their newer wave of designs. Jagt means hunting, I believe, in Danish, and as you can see from the lines of this, this is marketed and sold as sort of their folding hunting knife. Giant Mouse has often had outdoorsy vibes in a lot of their knives, but this really, with that Skinner blade shape there, really particularly calls to that hunting use case. Your pivot here is bearings, and it is a smooth bearing action. And then you've got a flipper tab right here, which works just fine. And then you can also, this opening hole is very useful. You can either slow roll it, you can spidey flick it. I'm not the best spidey flicker, but both of those work. Other specs, you've got a brass backspacer here, and I am 90% sure that is in fact brass, not brass colored titanium. Wire clip, as is standard for your Giant Mouse knives. Liner lock on the lockup. There's only a tiny bit of internal milling on that steel liner. More milling on the show side. And this particular version is this contoured and milled black canvas micarta. That's what they sell it as, black canvas. You can see sort of the canvas there, and this heavy contouring gives you that unusual texture. You can also get it in the standard green canvas micarta that they use for virtually all their knives, and a bright orange G10 if that's more your style. Again, playing to those hunting vibes. So those are your overall specifications. Now let's talk about what works with this knife and some of the things that don't. Let's get a quick size comparison before I go on. I tend to forget that size comparison. Here it is compared to your PM2, and you can see quite similar in size to the PM2, a little bit shorter. Now the key here, let's go back to that blade stock. You can see the blade stock is actually a little bit thicker than the PM2. This is about 145,000, this is 155, and carries that thickness. You can see here you've got a flat running all the way out to here, so your full thickness out to here, and even then there isn't a ton of distal taper. It does keep that thickness all the way up. By the way, the jimping up here, that's a Giant Mouse's signature. That's stolen from, not stolen, that's what Jesper Voxnæs tends to do in his designs. That is so that when you choke up and you put your knife up on the blade here, your thumb rests neatly on that jimping. It works quite well. One other size comparison, when we compare this to a smaller knife, here is your Delica. You can see it is, frankly, this is a mid-size knife. It's relatively chunky, it's relatively thick, it's a little bit heavier, again 4.2 ounces, but it is certainly not a big knife. which, some hunting knives can be. So let's do our positives, our neutrals, and our negatives about this knife. So I'm going to say the first positive here, the first thing that works well about this knife is the deployment, and the action is pretty solid. So again, two opening methods, and this is very much of Giant Mouse's sort of more modern school of design. You've got a very functional, well-designed flipper tab here. Two big jimps, that's it. And they're not even all that sharp. These are basically, big milled cutouts. You've got almost like a Sienkiewicz style flipper tab here, where it's really just sort of this angled pillar. Looks very nice, fits very well with the design, and as long as you light switch it, pull it back, very functional. This has a stiffer detent than some of their Italian-made knives historically have, and it's a very satisfying flip. You have a big, heavy blade here. Again, 155,000 stock is not thin. And even though it's 3.27 inches, which isn't huge, there's just a lot of blade here. So you get a nice, satisfying thunk when you flick it out. And frankly, as is typical for Giant Mouse, they do this, not a Spidey hole, but this curved sort of trapezoidal version. Very nice to slow roll out, very satisfying. They knocked that hole down just a little bit, as they tend to do these days. Very easy to open. You can flick it if you want to, and even somebody who sucks at Spidey flicking like me can get to that hole and access it nicely. Your liner lock access is good enough, nicely jimped on the inside with a nice little chamfer there, and it is again a smooth bearing action, not drop shutty, more fall shutty and controlled, which again tends to be what these good Italian actions out of Giant Mouse do, the Rio being sort of the exception. That's the only Giant Mouse that I've had that has been more fall shutty. Obviously some of their Riot stuff is a little more fall shutty, but this is a nice deployment and a nice action. And especially with this big blade up here, it's a fun knife. It's a fun knife to carry. It's a fun knife to play with. It's a fun knife to flip out. Yeah, and it's just a fun knife to have in your pocket and carry around all day. The second thing, the aesthetics, which is something that is very common for Giant Mouse. Giant Mouse is a collaboration between Jens Onso and Jesper Voxnes, as well as some business partners. Two very well-known custom knife designers that have been in the game for a long time, and they know how to design a knife. The way the lines flow all the way across, Onso likes to talk about how his designs are all about lines. Like the little subtle details, like how there's this little hip up at the front of the blade where it actually kicks a little back up that accentuates this swell right here. It's not straight. They could have cut this off. It would have been a more boring blade shape. The way it just elegantly moves right back into the back of the knife here, this nice elegant sway. The way sort of this curve, all the curves kind of balance, like there's a symmetry to this big curve of the Skinner blade here and this big curve along the back of the knife. Even when it's closed, it's just a nice rounded shape. Again, the flipper tab looks very nice. You got a little bit of angling out front, as they tend to do here. A nice flat there, and then again, two nicely balanced curves on the back. This big Skinner type blade is just a very cool looking blade. It's all belly. Your tip is all the way at the top line of the handle. You've got a nice sort of angular plunge there. You've got a nice aesthetic chamfer on the opening hole, not just functional, but aesthetic. Nice satin finish. It's just a very pretty version of the Skinner blade. Love the way the flipper tab not quite entirely nestles into the handle there, still deliberately showing itself just a little bit. You get that little extra flint of chrome there, which also, helps them make it stick out far enough on the back here. And then the way they have done these handles is aesthetically very nice. And this black canvas is the most striking because you get this sort of pattern. This is contoured and milled. So there is a contour this way. It's flat this way, but there's a one directional contour, and then you've got this relatively complex swoopy milling pattern all the way across the handle there. I don't exactly love the way it sort of terminates here. It's kind of like TRM's work, where they didn't really think of a great way to migrate it onto the flat, so it kind of just ends like this part here looks a little cheap. But frankly, overall, it's just a handle that is nice to look at. There's a lot of interesting visual detail here. You get that with the pop of, you add the pop of color on the backspacer, you add the fact that it looks virtually identical, meaning just as nice from both sides because it's a liner lock. Adding to the deployment and action, the aesthetics make this simply a cool knife to carry. This is a cool knife to have, a cool knife to have in your hand, a cool knife to, show off, admire, things like that. It's fun. And then the third thing, and if you've watched any of my other Giant Mouse reviews, you know that this is going to be in the positive. The ergonomics of the Jagt are excellent. I don't think I've had, no, strike that. There have been a couple of the Riot ones that have not had excellent ergonomics. But the ergonomics on this one, for its intended use, it's meant basically to sit in this one grip. Thumb, I guess you can choke up here if you really want to for your precision cuts. And actually, this is pretty comfortable, where you put this finger on this flat here, and then you can get up to that jimping. So this is sort of for your push cuts. The rounded contoured handle here nests very neatly, very nicely into your palm, and then you're right up next to the blade, so you can just push into that material very directly, or you can choke back here. And this nice taper toward the end with that little bit of hook. You get all four fingers right there. Again, the contoured wraps right into your hand. This whole pattern gives you a little bit more texture because this micarta is relatively smoothly polished, so the texture is doing most of the work. But you have, because of this big front finger index here, the contouring and the sort of sharp edges right here, and then this curve on the back, tons and tons of control over this blade in use. It's comfortable in the hand while still being secure in the hand. This is a knife that feels very comfortable even in a pinch grip, something like that, where I'm anchoring my middle finger in that index. Very controlled over the blade. I can push this through material, if I'm pushing it through cardboard, pushing it through plant material, pushing it through, drywall, carpet, anything like that. This feels very secure in the hand without feeling uncomfortable. It's just all of these curves offset very nicely. It's a nice assertive handle design that is designed to lock your hand into place in one of these grips. Basically, whichever finger is in this index here is really anchoring the handle into its position, and it wants to stay there. This is very secure in the hand in every grip you can use, and that is consistently great. I'm not surprised whatsoever that the Jagt has great ergonomics, because the vast majority of Giant Mouse knives have, and frankly, the only time they struggle with the ergonomics is when they try to branch a little bit outside of their comfort zone. One thing that is going to be neutral here, the fit and finish is fine. Again, lots of interesting details. They have done everything, or they've tried to do a little bit more than Giant Mouse tends to do. And the fact is, this is a $215 knife, so it's not expensive for an Italian-made knife. And I will tell you, the tolerances aren't the tightest in the world. Like you can see, gaps around the screws. The gaps between the blade and the handle are a little bit larger than I'd like. This did require some break-in when I got it. It's relatively smooth now, but it was not smooth when I first got it. I've never had any play or anything like that, and it's always been very nicely centered. I have no issues with the fit and finish. Nothing is wrong here, and especially the blade is very nicely done. All the grinds, all the cuts and contours and things like that are very nicely done. It's neutral because, frankly, there's just nothing impressive about the fit and finish in and of itself. It is solid for the price you're paying here. And that's worth remarking for Giant Mouse, because Giant Mouse knives, especially in their early days, the fit and finish was a negative. If you remember our review of the Biblio in particular, that was a great example of that, of a knife that had an excellent design, but the fit and finish in particular was just really holding that knife back. It was not at the level it needed to be for the price. This is solid. It's good. There's nothing positive. It's not like there's anything that is impressive about what they're doing here. But it's fine. It's fine. And then I'm going to say neutral is the blade design. And by design, I mean the theory of what they're going for with the blade. Because it's cool and it's well thought out. You can see that there's going to be something in the negative here about this blade. But again, this is a very cool take on the Skinner blade shape. So a Skinner blade shape, what you want in a Skinner is you want tons and tons of belly. You want, for a hunting knife, you want something that has tons of belly, and that's what this is, continuous belly for those long slicing cuts. You also tend to want a high tip so that you can easily, do these long carving cuts or long slicing cuts, whether it's into, an animal skin or meat or just, any softer material in particular, but also, plant materials, things like that. And even for harder materials, when you want to do long slicing cuts, having a long belly and a high point can make those cuts easier. And the fact is, they did choose to use MagnaCut on this, which at $215 is a very nice choice. And that is a very good choice of steel for a blade that is supposedly used for hunting. Because its edge retention is solid to excellent. It is virtually stainless, so you don't need to worry about any guts or debris or anything like that corroding your knife. And it's tough. So if you're using this to carve and you run into a bone or something like that, or you're, using this and you're hacking into a tree or hacking into some tougher plant material or something like that. If you're using this around the house and you run into a staple, or you're pushing it through drywall and things like that, and you just run into, you slip and slam it against a stud, whatever. MagnaCut is a tough enough steel that it will hold up. And you combine that with a 155 thousandths blade stock, this is a tough blade. Again, I love this little swoop here. I love visually. This would have been so much less interesting as a simple, either clip point or, straight back design. It's almost got like a scimitar-ish or sort of like a scabbard, for lack of a better term. I don't know. There's like a piratey feel to it almost. It's just a cool looking blade that really takes some of the signature elements of a hunting knife and kind of takes them a bit to an extreme. So it looks nice, and there are areas in which it is functional because of its design, particularly with this sort of slightly hooked handle and the fact that those ergonomics give you so much control. It's very easy to drag this through long cuts. But there is one big negative with this knife, and unfortunately, in my experience, it is a big enough negative that it almost undermines the entire rest of the knife, and that is the blade performance. Let me scooch this over here. The big area that I feel they misstepped was making this stock this thick. 155 thousandths is very thick stock, especially for a knife that you want to be slicey. Now, with a grind this tall, they could potentially have made this a very slicey knife. And you can see, over at the plunge here, they did do a lot to get from that thick spine down to a thinner edge. But the fact is, this blade just does not cut that well. It is not that sharp. It's certainly not that sharp out of the box. Frankly, I don't think it could even get all that sharp unless you go really aggressive with your sharpening. it's just, and you can sort of see when you look at the heel of the blade there, it's just a little bit of a chunker behind the edge. And that thick stock is a lot to blame, but also the grind is shallower than it could be. And the problem is, for everything that I just said that this blade design is really good at, with the exception of like chopping through wood, which honestly is like a secondary case for a knife of this shape, you want it to be able to slice, you want to be able to bite easily, you want it to be able to cut really well. And this blade, every single time I've used it, has been frustrating to use. Not only is that edge not particularly keen, not only does that edge, have a hard time biting into material, but because this stock is so thick, when I'm dragging it through cardboard, when I'm trying to cut through plant material, I didn't use this for skinning. I haven't been out in the backcountry recently, so I understand. I am not using it for its intended purpose, but I feel like the tasks I have used it for, which is included cutting both soft and hard materials, are sufficient for me to understand how it would be in those use cases. The fact is, anytime you have to pass this entire blade through something, that thick stock starts to get in your way, and you do start to really feel this blade drag. And I will say, I just reviewed, sorry about that. Let's get this back on here. I just reviewed this by Mito here, which has almost the exact same blade stock. But it just, for whatever reason, and I think honestly a lot of it has to do with having a bit more taper toward the tip, the Spy Mito did not feel nearly as draggy as the Jagt did. And a lot of that is also the Spy Mito is just significantly sharper down at the edge than the Jagt is. The Jagt, it just doesn't cut well. In my experience, it just does not cut well. It did not cut well in the garden with plant material. It did not cut well around the house. It was actually downright frustrating to use for things like breaking down boxes and tape and stuff like that. This was one of the less effective knives to use to break down boxes that I have handled in quite some time. And that is considering that, I got to know how good these ergonomics were, because every time I tried to push it through material, the knife was pushing back the entire time because there was so much drag, there was so much resistance as I went to cut. It was effortful to push this blade through the material. And so it's good that the ergonomics are as good as they are, because you're going to be feeling a lot of pressure on this knife as you use it to cut. And so the problem is, these are knives. You're getting it to cut stuff. And unfortunately, my experience with this knife is that there's lots of very cool things about it, but it just doesn't do a great job at actually cutting. And actually, I guess there's one more neutral thing I'll go back to, which is the carry and weight. The other thing that was a bit of a drawback, I'm going to put it as neutral because Giant Mouse tends to quite deliberately make their handles a little bit more big, a little bit thicker, because they're favoring ergonomics. But this is a big and heavy knife in the pocket. 4.2 ounces isn't that heavy, but when you fold this up, this is a pretty big and pretty thick chunk in your pocket. You compare this to the PM2, it is quite a bit thicker than the PM2 in the pocket. It doesn't take up, it's about the same space, in this dimension, but it's even thicker in this dimension and approximately the same weight. I have titanium scales on this one, so this one's a bit heavier now, but you're talking similar weight to the PM2, even thicker. This feels chunky in the pocket. Obviously, the benefit of that is you get these nice, thick, contoured handles that give you that great ergonomic experience, but as is typical for Giant Mouse, they just didn't do that much to reduce the weight. They did do some pretty significant milling on this side. And, maybe with a blade this thick, there isn't that much they even theoretically could have done to get the weight down. But in addition to the blade performance, which again is mediocre at best, the other reason that I really only carried this knife when I deliberately carried it for the sake of reviewing it is it's heavy, it's chunky, it's one of those knives that I didn't want to carry anything else in the same pocket as the knife because the knife was just taking up the entire pocket. And I felt it swinging around all day in a way that I don't with knives that are either sleeker or lighter. This feels like a boat anchor in the pocket because it is both big and relatively heavy, at least for a knife of this size with only 3.3 inches of blade. So those are my thoughts on the giant Mouse Ace Jagt. It's a cool knife. It's a fun knife. It gives a very good first impression because it's a relatively unique design. There's lots of really cool aspects of the blade shape. The deployment, once it breaks in, is really nice. The design of this flipper tab, the placement of the opening hole, all that, really good. The blade grinds are nice. The handle contouring is nice. The handle materials are nice. The execution is more than good enough. And frankly, it's a very interesting and exciting package for $215, especially now that Giant Mouse has gotten their Italian factories dialed in. And it looks like it could be good, but I'm still a little mystified about why on something that's supposedly a hunting knife, not even a camping knife, but a hunting knife, Giant Mouse threw blade stock this thick on there and did a grind that was this relatively shallow because honestly, the blade performance is just not where I need it to be. And so even though there's a lot that is positive about this knife, it's very cool, it's very fun, it's very interesting. The problem that it's got is a really bad problem for a knife to have. And so between that and the fact that it is for me a little chunky, I have found it hard to justify carrying this knife. And I will be selling it pretty soon after this review is done. I'm sure this knife has some fans, and I hope that some of them love it and had a better experience than I did, but that has been my experience with the Giant Mouse Ace Jagt. Cool design, don't love the execution. Hope you found this helpful, and if you do love the design and you don't care about the cutting performance, for $215 it's a solid buy. It's a fun knife for that price. So if you're not performance centric, which I know a lot of knife people, if they're really thinking about it, they aren't. You know, they're buying these as toys as much as they are things that cut. It will cut. It will do the job. You just need to know that you're buying this for the aesthetics. You're buying this for the feel. You're not buying it as a user. If you're looking for a knife that is going to do the kind of tasks this is marketed for, there are almost certainly better buys. In fact, there are all sorts of knives with, high point, either straight backs or other sorts of, high drop points in this $200-ish range. Frankly, I would say from a utility perspective, get the Spy Mito over this, since I literally just reviewed it. Relatively similar aesthetics. Still has that high drop point, could still do a lot of the same tasks that you're going to use this one for. Same even thick blade stock if you want thick blade stock. This is absolutely a better knife as a user, and it's not that much more money. Also, happens to be made in Italy. So those are my thoughts. Hope you found this helpful. Let me know if there are any knives that you would like me to review, and please let me know if you got any comments or thoughts down below. Hope this was useful. Have a good day.